Good afternoon. My name is Ray Struyk, and I was really very pleased when Tarek and Paul asked me to speak to you briefly today about the management of policy research organizations, which are often more familiarly called think tanks. I often start an extended discussion of think tank management by going through what I call the 7 attributes of a successfully managed think tank. Given the time limits today, I want to focus on 2 management areas where a large share of think tanks really struggle. Those are first, staff motivation, and secondly, making the best use of your resources by ensuring that those available to the think tank really get spent on what they're supposed to be spent on. So let's begin with staff motivation. Staff at a well-managed think tank are productive. They produce high-quality work that's policy relevant and often innovative. And it's obvious your staff is by far your most valuable asset. Research teams often identify problems to work on. They carry out the research. They produce the reports, and very often are key in disseminating the findings to policymakers. So it's obvious that they're key players in this operation. They also account for 70% of your spending. I mean, that's kind of a universal rule. It's interesting. It applies whether you're talking to a think tank in Russia or the United States. It's pretty typically 70%. So there are 3 tools that you have available to you to help with staff motivation. The first is an array of incentives that can be strategically employed, and we're going to talk about these in just a minute. Second are the annual performance assessments, where goals are set and staff's path to greater productivity and growth are charted. And thirdly, is training, which is really part and parcel of the other 2. Offering training is an incentive in itself, and also it's a fundamental piece of the growth possibilities for staff. So on the slide that's coming up now, you see a list of 7 incentives. And you probably employ these, or some of these, and others as well. At the top of the list is the one that everybody thinks of first, which is cash. Higher salaries, think about bonus systems. And cash is important. You have to pay some minimum amount to attract people. But there's a lot of literature out there that says cash after some point really is not the best incentive, the most effective incentive. And if you think for a minute about what your staff is doing, when they have a successful project, they actually affect society in a positive way. That's a pretty heady experience. They also get to be people about town. They're experts, they're known, sometimes they're on TV. In the community, in the policy community, they're something of a feature. That's all very seductive. People don't want to give it up. So there's a lot of satisfaction possible working at think tanks, and so my conclusion here is don't overrate the value of cash per se. Second item on the list is authorship. There are a few think tanks out there whose the authors' reports don't appear on publications. It's just by the XYZ think tank. And the think tank does that, so if they lose good people, nobody knows. It's just the XYZ. And you can do that, but it's obvious that's pretty hard on incentives. But there's another piece to the authorship point, and that is that senior authors need to be generous. Lots and lots of mid-level junior people get left off of reports where they've really made a contribution, and it's the primary author's call pretty much. But if the senior authors are a little bit generous and not just give this away, but when junior staff, less senior staff have earned it, include them as an author, obviously it's a very big boost to those individuals. It's also good for marketing. When you want to, 2 years from now, when you want to bid that person on a project, they've got their name on publications and reports that can be cited as a qualification. So it's building the institution in two ways when you do that. Third point on policy meetings, that the standard protocol, I believe, is that the most senior person who's worked on a project goes to call on the deputy minister or the NGO that you're trying to cooperate with to move the policy issue along in the process. It didn't really cost much to take a mid-level person with you. And you have to, I've done this and all of a sudden found my meeting being hijacked by the mid-level person. So a little discussion about the ground rules before you do that. But think of the reward to this mid-level staffer who actually gets to meet with the deputy minister. I mean, it's just really big stuff. The fifth item on the list is sort of called chance for growth. And this is very much about the annual performance assessment. And there are many think tanks, many think tank managers who believe, oh, I see the staff every day, I know what they're about, we don't really need to do this. And if they do have an annual assessment system in place, it's kind of mechanical because they don't really see much benefit from it because they know. And I think the reality is they don't know. This performance assessment is the one time a year that the staffer and his supervisor sit down and really have a conversation, a well-prepared conversation on what's the staffer accomplished during the year, what are their goals for the next year, what do they think they need to do to reach those goals, including help from the supervisor and maybe some training. That, as I said, this just doesn't occur without this kind of conversation. The first part of the overall assessment is this process I just talked about, the conversation. And there's a lot in the book, this Managing Think Tank book that Paul and Tarek mentioned to you about that. The second part of it is setting goals. And these goals really need to be concrete. And the third part, of course, is a concrete plan. But so think of it. You've got a fellow that's been working with you for 3 years, and he's been pretty much crunching numbers. He's very good at it, very efficient with the spreadsheets. He's running regressions. Great. You really love him for all the stuff. He helps you interpret the results. But, he's essentially condemned unless you help him move along. And so you say to him, okay, we're going to try to cut you back to about half time on this kind of statistical work. And this year I want you doing some literature reviews, and I want you to start writing up sections of the report. And then you review them, of course, and you critique them, and you move them along. If you don't really take the time to work that out, it won't happen. And this talented person is likely to just move on because he gets frustrated after a couple of years. Another item on the list there is presentations to the board. Almost all board meetings, one piece, one block of time is devoted to a couple of presentations to inform the board members about the organization's work. And the board members really like this because they then are kind of ahead of the rest of the policy community on interesting findings, and they can talk to people about it at cocktail parties or whatever. And senior staff really prize being selected to make these presentations. It's a big deal. Of course, the members of your board are often very senior people in the community. They get the kind of exposure they can't find any other way. So anyway, the moral to this story is that you really need to think about incentives and whether you're applying these actively, thoughtfully, and strategically, most importantly, that it's really thought through. So now